All right. Welcome to today's webinar on behalf of Lee Summit Cares. Lee Summit Cares mobilizes community partners to develop a culture of physical and mental wellness for Lee Summit youth and families that inspires positive, healthy choices. My name is Carrie Gray, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist who is also a prevention manager for Rediscover Mental Health. And I'm happy to be here today to discuss today's topic, which is, are you listening? And so today we're going to be talking a lot about the importance of listening and communication and how that helps to improve our relationships. So specifically, you will get an opportunity to do a self-evaluation so that you can see where you are with your current listening skills. We're going to talk a little bit about the benefits of really putting energy and effort into listening, characteristics of a good listener, and we're also going to talk a little bit about how you can frame a message so that other people are more apt to listen to you. And finally, we'll wrap up with a few ideas on things that you can do to diffuse conflict. So let's start first with our self-evaluation. Here are some common mistakes we often make when listening to another person. And so as I read through these, you can make a mental check of whether or not this is something that you do. One would be, do you interrupt the person who is talking? Do you show impatience as you wait for the speaker to finish? Do you misinterpret what is said such that the sender needed to correct you? Do you demonstrate by gestures that you are uninterested, meaning perhaps you're looking at your phone or checking emails or watching the game? Another question is, do you spend more time talking rather than listening? Do you find that your mind wanders such that you miss what is actually being said? Do you listen only until you want to say something? Or do you hear only what you want to hear? Do you assume you know the speaker's intention? And do you listen for the facts but miss the meaning of the message? As I said earlier, these are common mistakes that we often make because let's face it, being a good listener takes a lot of energy and focus. And so as I share with you characteristics of a good listener, think in terms of how you can start implementing these ideas within your own relationships. So let's talk a little bit about why listening is so important. A question I often like to ask people is, who actually does the most work? Is it the person who is speaking or the person who is listening? And you guessed right if you said the person who is listening. And this slide really illustrates some of the reasons why listening is important, and we will get into what makes it so hard in the next slide. So listening is an important part of relationships. When we take time to truly focus our attention on another person, it demonstrates that we truly care about them. It builds trust. It shows that you respect them, their point of view, even if you don't necessarily see it the same way. Listening also helps eliminate misunderstandings that could lead to wasted time, conflict, and high degrees of stress. Listening helps eliminate conflict. It also encourages empathy, a skill that is critical in relationships. And overall, when we take the time to truly listen to another, it improves our overall communication. So when we apply this to parenting, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that we want to stay connected with our kids as they continue to grow older. And some of the mistakes that parents make, especially as their kids move into the teenage years, is they spend less time listening and more time talking and lecturing and informing their children on how they should be thinking and what they need to do. When we do this, we create an environment where it's not fun to listen to us. Our kids feel disrespected. They don't feel heard. And when that occurs, a person is less likely to come back to you for a discussion in the future. And we certainly want our kids to feel connected to us as they navigate the challenges that come along with life. So what makes that hard? Well, there's a lot of distractions in our lives. Some of those distractions are internal distractions, such as maybe it's just been a really long day and we're feeling fatigue and we don't have the energy to truly listen. Other distractions could be the environment that we're in. Perhaps it's a noisy environment and it's difficult to even hear what the other person is saying. Defensiveness is another thing to consider. Oftentimes, people feel defensive when they're having to hear something that they truly don't want to hear. Intolerance is another example of an obstacle, as well as just really not having a good experience with the person who is talking. And so it's hard to listen to someone with whom we don't have a great deal of respect for. Sometimes we make assumptions about the conversation and the intent of the person, and need to be aware of partial or pseudo listening. And that is when we're kind of listening, but we're really focusing on composing that email or watching that game that's on TV. And finally, a lack of interest. And so, as you can see, there are many obstacles that make it difficult for us to truly focus our attention on listening. Perhaps you can relate to the cartoon I found where it's showing the father of the soon-to-be newborn child and the mom saying, "Hey, wait a minute and really listen to me. My water broke." And so this is a good illustration of what happens when we don't truly listen to another person. So, what can we do to become better listeners? Active listening is the key, and it involves several different components. And so, I'm going to go through these briefly, but then I'll dive into them deeper in the slides to come. So, when you think of your people or the people with whom you have a relationship with, think about those who are really good listeners and consider what are some of the things that they do that allow you to feel that they're really listening and that you feel heard after you have a conversation with those people. Chances are they're demonstrating and using many of the skills that are listed here on this slide. They're in the moment. They're empathetic. They reflect back what they hear you saying. They might even ask open-ended questions to help clarify and make sure they're following you correctly. And finally, they will confirm for understanding, because sometimes we get it wrong. So let's start with the first one, be in the moment. Being present during a conversation is critical. Perhaps you can relate to this scenario. You plan to go out to dinner with a group of friends who perhaps you haven't seen for a long time. You're seated at the dinner table at the restaurant, and you notice that many of those folks are on their cell phones. How does that make you feel? If it's me, it makes me feel like I'm not being paid attention to, that I don't matter, that they're distracted by another conversation. And so being there in the moment and removing things that could in the way of that is critical. And so, for example, you put down the cell phone, or perhaps you need to stop or close the laptop or turn off the game, or just simply sit down and focus on what the person is saying. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that if you're not able to give your person your full attention at that particular time, it's better to just delay the conversation to a later time. And so this might sound like, I can't have this conversation now, but let's talk after school. And so then once the child comes home after school, it's important that we follow up and create that space and time where we can truly listen. Another thing that's important is to practice empathy. Empathy is the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another person and imagine what it would feel like to be that person. Stephen Covey also talks about good management skills in terms of our business relationships. In his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of his tenements on listening is to seek first to understand, then to be understood. What we find is that when we first set aside our own needs to listen and hear the needs of another person, that our communication widens and people are more likely to then listen to what we have to say as part of that conversation. And so to practice empathy, we want to listen beyond the words to better understand and validate the person's feelings. And so, for example, some of those statements might sound like this: you sound frustrated with your math teacher, or it sounds like you think the decision is unfair. It could be, I hear you are sad about your friend moving. The key here is to work to identify and to put a label on the feeling that your child is experiencing and to validate that feeling. When we say things to our children, such as, you're really making a big deal out of nothing, it doesn't validate their feelings and it makes them less likely to come and share with us in the future. A third practice that we can use is what we refer to as reflexive listening. And so how this works is essentially you repeat what you heard the other person say. And this provides an opportunity for clarification throughout the conversation. It also shows the person that you're listening to what they have to say. And so some examples of reflexive listening are as follows. I hear you saying that you would like more time with friends. I hear you saying that you want to take a break before doing homework. I hear you saying that you prefer grandma's mashed potatoes over my recipe. As I said, sometimes it's hard to listen when we don't necessarily want to hear what the person is saying. Another strategy is to ask open-ended questions. Perhaps you can relate to this scenario. Your child comes home from school and you ask them, how was your day? And they say, fine. It's sometimes difficult to get more information out of people. And so framing questions in a way that is open-ended can be very helpful in getting more information. So for example, as we're listening and gathering information, a question that we could ask is, what would you like to see happen moving forward? Or another important one is, how can I help? What is the hardest part of school right now? Or why do you want to stop playing soccer? These questions help you to better understand the perspective and the decision-making process that your child is going through. It also reinforces, again, the fact that you are listening and also letting them know, hey, I believe in you. I want to hear your perspective. I would like your thoughts on decision-making moving forward. And that is very important for that parent-child relationship, especially as our kids grow older and get closer to leaving home. So the final part of the active listening is to confirm your understanding. And so this is where you get a summary statement that summarizes the facts you gathered. It also shows the speaker, again, that you have truly listened. And so a summary statement might sound like this. Here's what I heard. You would like to have grandma's mashed potatoes, my stuffing, and pumpkin pie included in our Thanksgiving meal. Another example, this is what I heard. You would like to have 1 hour to play video games before you do your homework. All right. And so once you've confirmed for understanding, then it's the right time to ask permission to share your perspective or your thoughts on whatever that situation is. And so we'll go into how to send an effective message in the slides to come. But first, important to think about the context of communication as we prepare for being an effective speaker. Body language is a critical part of face-to-face communication. And that is why it's so important that we intentionally have conversations, especially about important topics or areas of conflict, when we are face to face with another person, simply because we lose a lot of the meaning that we can gather through body language. So as you can see here by the breakdown in how communication is measured, 55% is body language, 38% is our tone of voice, and 7% is the actual words that we use. So it's important to keep in mind that the words we use are important, but we also need to be aware of the body language that we are expressing, as well as the other person. And in addition to that, our and theirs tone of voice, because these things can be very good clues for how we're doing in that conversation, whether or not that other person is listening. And this can help us to change up how we're communicating in order to keep others engaged. So let's first start with body language. When we think of parenting, certainly we have to do a lot of redirection with behavior. And many of the things that our kids do, especially I would say when our kids make mistakes or they're not obeying or doing the things that they're supposed to be doing, a natural parent reaction is to be angry and frustrated. And so if you look at your screen and you look at the dad on the right, that is the body language of an angry, frustrated parent. And so a natural response to that by the children is shown in the pictures provided. When an individual, whether it's a child or an adult, feels threatened, this triggers the stress hormone cortisol. It also triggers what we refer to as fight, flight, or freeze. And when a person is in fight, flight, or freeze, they are not able to listen to what you're saying. And so it's very important that you be mindful of how you're conveying your message and have conversations when you are calm and in a good place, and when your child or children are also calm. As you can see from the bottom images, as this mother and daughter are having a communication, you might ask yourself, is this going well? It doesn't appear to be going well, because I'm guessing that if I were a fly on the wall, that neither of them are taking the time to really listen to each other's perspective. So keep in mind the body language that you convey when having conversations. The second piece is that tone of voice. As I mentioned in the previous slide, if we have a loud, angry, frustrated tone of voice, that's going to trigger that automatic stress response. And we know that no one can listen when they're feeling threatened. And so it's important to take time to communicate in a calm, respectful manner. When we do this, it makes it much easier to listen to the other person, even when we don't necessarily want to hear what they have to say. It also engages the other person in being able to problem solve. And let's face it, when we have a good conversation where we're able to resolve a problem in a respectful way, it builds the relationship and it builds additional trust. So, two simple things, not always very simple, but two things to keep in mind as we move forward are monitoring yours and theirs, body language, and tone of voice. Now, let's talk about how to send an effective message. Oftentimes, it's difficult to have people listen to us simply because the way we're sending the message is creating defensiveness. So, some things that we can do to position ourselves to be more successful is number one, pick a good time and place for the conversation. So, just like in your work environment, if you have something important to talk about, you don't want to barge in to a colleague's office and start rambling on, because that is not respectful to their time or to them as an individual. The same is true in how we relate to our children. We need to think about an appropriate time and place to have a conversation. One of the things to consider, for example, is having a lengthy conversation while everyone is hurrying to get out the door in the morning is not a realistic time or place. Another thing is to consider what you hope to accomplish. And so, why do you need to have this conversation? What is your end goal? Also, it's important to always be respectful. And so that goes back to being a good listener, as well as sending that message in a respectful way. And finally, we talked about body language and tone, but we can look at how to communicate an effective message respectfully by using things such as I messages, positive phrasing, and as I keep repeating, active listening. So let's talk a little bit more about the first one here, and that is the I message versus the you message. By definition, I statements essentially speak for yourself and take responsibility for what you say. And so they essentially focus your message on how you perceive a situation and why you want to discuss it. You statements, on the other hand, create defensiveness. So let's look at some examples so that you can see the difference. I feel frustrated when I come home to a messy house. A you statement would be, you never clean up after yourself. Another example, I will wash the clothes that are put in the laundry basket. Or if you had bothered to put your clothes in the laundry, you would have clean jeans. Let's face it, when we use I statements and we articulate our message in a positive way, people are more likely to listen to us. Another thing to consider is how we phrase a statement. As I mentioned earlier, when our children make poor choices, a natural response is to be angry or frustrated. And so it's important that we are able to have a discussion with our child once we have control over our emotions. Because if you respond with anger and frustration, it's like putting gasoline on a fire. The problem is only going to grow and get worse, and both of you are going to have a bad experience. So let's look at some of the differences in comparing positive phrasing to negative phrasing. So scenario is that you come home from work and your child is playing outside. You walk inside and you see that nothing has been done that child was supposed to do. And so we are feeling a little frustrated, of course, but we take a breath, we calm ourselves down. When we're calm, we go to our child and we say, feel free to join your friends when your chores are finished. Thank you. If we had said, you're not going anywhere, or get back inside here, you need to finish your chores, now we're using more fighting words, which surely the child may oblige and come inside and do what he or she is supposed to do, but this is not a good way to communicate in relationships. Let's try another one. Let's say you have a teenager in your home who can be kind of snooty at times. Perhaps there's an attitude and sometimes they speak to you in a disrespectful way. So negative phrasing or the natural response would be, you should or you need to be more respectful. Another way to phrase that same sentiment is, I'm happy to do things for you when I feel treated with respect. And so you're also showing that child how to relate to you in a respectful way. You're setting a very important boundary in how you expect to be treated. Here's another one. Perhaps you've dealt with arguing in your home, whether it's a small child or an older child or teenager, or even some of the adults in your life. Some people simply like to argue rather than listen. We all know this is frustrating. So a common response might be, why do you have to argue about everything? Instead, let's use, I love you too much to argue, and perhaps remove yourself from the situation so that the arguing stops. And finally, with little kids and sometimes older kids, whining can be an issue, and it can certainly grate on your nerves. So it would not be uncommon to say, stop whining, you're giving me a headache. Again, we're going to set a limit and show the child how to behave by saying and role modeling the statement, I will listen when your voice is calm like mine. And so by using positive phrases, we keep our children and other adults engaged in the communication process. When we use negative phrasing, it's more likely to put the person we're communicating with in fight, flight, or freeze stress response. So let's apply what we've learned today to a situation where we diffuse conflict. So the bottom line here is really illustrated in this cartoon. So the boss says, Buck, you get along with everyone. What's your secret? And Buck says, nobody hates a listener. That is the key to our success. And so when we're looking at or dealing with a conflict, and let's face it, anytime there's a relationship, there's a potential for conflict. And conflict can be very useful and productive when we approach it the right way. It can be destructive when it's not handled correctly. So as you look at the strategies on the left side of the slide, it focuses on healthy, appropriate ways to address conflict. So number one, when we're dealing with our children or another adult, it's important to address the problem when it is not taking place. And so it's easier to be objective and have a good conversation when we're not in the midst of the conflict, where we're likely feeling angry, frustrated, and emotional. And so it's important to be aware of a good time to have that conversation. Another thing that I like to tell people that I think is very important is when you go into that conversation, assume positive intent until proven otherwise. A lot of times, poor communication results in misunderstanding. People make assumptions when they don't have information, and those assumptions are not always correct. So when you go into that conversation, it's important to have a good attitude that assumes positive intent. As I mentioned earlier, use the active listening skills that I shared with you. When it's your turn to speak, use your effective speaker skills, using the I messages, using positive phrasing. Another important thing is to own your part. Within a relationship, we all contribute to whatever that conflict is. And so by owning your part, you're more likely to grow out of the situation. And that also improves trust and respect within the relationship. Simply apologizing to a child for getting something wrong goes a great deal towards earning and experiencing trust. And let's face it, people are not perfect. Parents are not perfect. We're going to make mistakes. I remember I have certainly 4 children myself. And with my oldest child, who's now 27, when I was raising her, especially through the teen years, I would find myself from time to time saying, I'm sorry. This is my first experience raising a teenager, and I got it wrong this time. And that did a great deal in terms of building our relationship. Another final piece as we look at diffusing conflict is to together to focus on solutions. And so by listening to what the other person has to say first, and then speaking in a way where that person is able to hear you better, the two of you can work on coming up with a solution that is agreeable. And it's important also then to check in later to see, how did it go? Is this working, or do we need to switch things up a little bit in order to be more effective? And so that is all the information that I have to share with you today. And so if you would like to have more information on future webinars as well as parenting classes, do visit Lee Summit Cares at www.lscares.org. You will likely receive an evaluation after listening to this webinar. If you could please help us out by providing us some feedback, we always appreciate what you need to say, and it is very useful in moving forward and making our work and your webinar experience. So thank you so much for being here.